Hi, I'm Rachel, and I'm finally here to do my January 2019 wrap-up. A bit later than I might have hoped, but I guess I'll make this short and sweet and get it out there. So I started out the month and the year on a really high note by reading Rachel Kadish's The Weight of Ink, which I'll show you on my tablet here because I long since returned it to the library. The Weight of Ink is a sprawling historical fiction novel, although not sprawling enough to take part in the mammoth readathon that'll be happening in March as originated by Jason at Old Blues Chapters and Verse. But still, it felt pretty epic to me. We alternate between two time periods. We start in London in the early 2000s, where a change of hands happens of ownership in this house in Richmond, and the new owners are trying to turn it into an art museum, and they're doing renovations, and some contractor pops open a little door and they come across these old artifacts that look like that they are of a Jewish origin in the 17th century. So the dude who now owns the house remembers an old teacher of his who specialized in 17th century Jewish history in England, and so he calls her over, and this woman realizes that this is a huge find, that it is a brand new scribe and a new set of characters from the Amsterdam Jewish community. Then we switch over to the 17th century in London and find out that this scribe was actually a woman, and this is something actually that the historian and her research assistant find out on their own too. And the woman is a scribe for a rabbi who is trying to bring some Jewish education to London's Jewish community. This is a really auspicious start for the Jewish community in London. I mean, they'd mostly been living in secret in England for the past couple hundred years, but very recently England decided to open its doors again officially to some sort of open Jewish practice. You know, Jews weren't banned from the country anymore, which was particularly an auspicious time for that because there was a large Amsterdam Jewish community that was actually Portuguese. I mean, there's a lot of migration in the Jewish community, largely due to persecution, and in this particular case, these were Jews that came from Portugal and were running from the Inquisition. Kadish's writing is so rich and lush, and I particularly fell in love with the 17th century part. Maybe part of it had to do with reading more biographies and nonfiction last year, and historical fiction books sort of ingested the idea of history with more creativity again and more nuance to characters that of course you can't get reading nonfiction because we don't have actually a window into the minds of these characters. I mean, not that specifically anyway. And the characters in the 17th century, particularly Esther the scribe, who has this unusual opportunity to become a learned figure. She's just so wonderfully, vividly drawn. And at the end of the day, what really matters is that the characters and the setting are so rich and lush. And so too in the modern day with the characters in their rare manuscript room. I got such a thrill. All of my librarian training feels a tingling, although I think it felt like Kadish was trolling me personally sometimes when she had the historians acting rather abominably toward the documents, and her conservationist and librarian were like stiff-necked about it, but so was I, because, you know, they were doing some serious damage sometimes, guys, and, you know, there was some plotty stuff I should step away from now, but certainly some of the intriguing parts of the present day were to track how these historians could feel such a personal connection to this character of the past, even though they couldn't see into her specific life the way we as the readers could. But of course, to a large extent, anybody identifying that much with a historical figure is doing so through processing the ups and downs of their own lives and careers as much as, actually speaking about that person in particular. And Kadish wrote some really interesting 21st century characters too, including Helen Watt, who was this non-Jewish Jewish historian at the end of her career, and Aaron Levy, who's this cocksure at the beginning, Jewish-American boy at the beginning of his, graduate student. And yes, it was a long novel with lots of characters, but it really drew me into the world and drew me in to what was going on with everybody. And certainly what's exciting for me too is that I don't think I'll ever forget some of the specifics of the London Jewish community at the time and the Amsterdam Jewish community at the time, and particularly the story of Baruch Spinoza, who is our most famous apostate. He was banished from the Jewish community at the time in a really rare move of banished for life. That's not something that usually happens. And I sort of vaguely knew this history before, but now it feels much more centered in my mind, so I am thrilled at the book for that too. But mostly it's just a riveting read, and it answers these human questions about how to be your best self and be able to meld all those desires that come up in life, the desire to make a name for yourself intellectually and also find love and happiness within your personal life, and of course against these really vivid, wonderful backdrops. Next, I read the most recent Best American Short Stories, as edited by Roxane Gay, and there it goes anyway. This was my only ebook purchase of the year. I don't actually buy a lot of ebooks, but it's my tradition to start each new year by buying an ebook. I have a little collection on my iPad, not tablet, of that anthology. This year particularly stuck out to me due to all the political content. I think we throw around words like identity politics in a pejorative way, but I'm more in line with how the series editor Heidi Pittlor and Roxane Gay talk about it in their introductions, about how, politics inform us much more in a nuanced way than, just virtue signaling or something like that. I mean, everything you put into your identity, no matter how you really define yourself, has some backing in political realities about human rights and how you're represented within your country and your various cultures and how they intersect. I feel like most of the stories of a diverse set of authors and a diverse set of premises really made the mark, and I didn't find any that were too disappointing or felt too much like duds, either because of their writing or a couple that stuck out to me particularly were Cougar by Maria Anderson. I think it had the most polished writing, and it was about a young man in a small nowhere Midwestern town who has been abandoned by his father and his family. And there's a cougar terrorizing the area. There was some wonderful descriptive writing, and it was peppered with ideas of loneliness and contrasting opinions about the cougar. And I think the story I think about the most, in part because I'm dabbling with the idea of wanting to write something maybe along similar lines, is Boys Go to Jupiter by Danielle Evans. And it's the story of Claire, who's this shallow, white college girl who sort of thoughtlessly has a picture posted of herself wearing a Confederate bikini outfit, and then when one of her black dorm mates expresses discomfort, she just sort of belligerently keeps putting her foot in her mouth, and thanks to the social medias, everything just continues to escalate. So I think it's a fascinating juxtaposition about what social media with these controversial situations, what it means for people nowadays, but it's also about how and why someone who's shallow and doesn't really have much of a political opinion might put her foot in her mouth so much although I do think her backstory was a little bit too dramatic. And there's a whole lot going on in these stories, from how social media permeates our lives nowadays, because so many of these stories are present day. There's a story out of Canada about the Native American experience. There's stories about particularly the African American male experience in America, like with Control Negro by Jocelyn Nicole Johnson. And it's a really interesting juxtaposition again between what the protagonist is trying to do by dictating the life of his distant son versus how police sort of dictate motives onto the lives of black men. I really think this brought something home to me for the first time in terms of police violence against black men. So yeah, I think it was a really nice, good, strong collection. Next, I read Bread Givers by Anzia Jezierska. This is a 20th century novel, almost 100 years old now, written by one of our famous female Yiddish writers. This was her story about Sarah Smolinski, this young girl who's growing up in the projects, basically in New York City, the Lower East Side. Her father is traditionally observant and tyrannical. He doesn't work despite the family's abject poverty because he believes in his calling to study Torah all day. So he has his wife and his daughters basically providing his income, and that doesn't stop him from being just petty and vindictive and bullyish toward them. And every time he does really try to extend his hand as an authoritarian figure, he tends to get hoodwinked by people. I think it's a little bit over the top, his characterization. It certainly doesn't paint a very flattering picture of Jewish life at the time. And I think it's a little one-dimensional in that way. But certainly there are kernels of truth in it. And beyond that, Jezierska, in doing this story of having Sarah pursue a life beyond her familial expectations, probes a lot of other interesting stuff too, like what it means to be a person. And I think one of the big things beyond standing against the misogyny that her father is trying to foist on her is saying that she's trying to get herself out of poverty, because poverty really takes away from personhood. And I realized as I was reading this, especially in this time when poverty is so physically exhausting that you can barely feel like a person after you do all of this scrimping and scrounging, and it just takes everything to keep the house clean and to somehow get food on the table. So Sarah and Jezierska, and this novel is slightly autobiographical, put a premium on the New World ideals of education and, well, frankly, although she doesn't say it like this, capitalism, because when Sarah does get education and is able to get a teaching job and get some money, life does become a bit easier for her. Not only in terms of personal fulfillment, but in that she doesn't have to be exhausted by her circumstances anymore. The end of the novel does take a somewhat more forgiving tone, where she's able to find some common ground with her father, and frankly, I thought in a way it's understandable, because they both sort of embrace this sort of selfishness in order to maintain intellectual lives, and everyone that Sarah criticizes and everyone who criticizes Sarah, they don't seem to fully understand and grasp that this selfishness that they see in one another is the only way that they can have any sort of self-determination in saying, you know, I deserve to have a say in my own life. I thought that was very intriguing as well. So I feel like I had a lot of weird conflicting feelings about this novel. I think it might have been a more nuanced portrayal. We might have demanded that if it were written later, in after the 1920s. But then again, as mentioned, it did bring up a lot of intriguing points. Next, I finished an audiobook, so here's a picture. This is The Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor. It is her second book in her YA epic fantasy duology, which started with Strange the Dreamer. This series takes place in a unique, fantastical world where this race of godlike creatures have been raining havoc, particularly on this one city called Weep, where they have their fortress, which is this angel-shaped citadel, literally blocking the sky and stopping the inhabitants from moving much. And one of the ways they set anchor was like crushing, literally crushing their major academic and government institutions. And just for 200 years, these godlike figures have been terrorizing the people, particularly by abducting women and sometimes men to spend time in the citadel where their memories are then wiped, but basically they're raped and they have children, and we don't know really what happens to the children, but it's a really horrible situation. And also in the backstory, we have this heroic figure who was actually a victim himself of this. He became the god killer who killed all of the gods, and also all of the god spawn, the children of these humans and gods. Or so he thinks, because some almost 20 years later, he goes to find some help from outside the city, including our main character, Laszlo Strange, to try and find a way to move the citadel, which is still looming over them. And in the citadel, unbeknownst to anybody, are some survivors of the attack, and they were all young children. And it's a story very much about trauma, but the trauma of the people on the ground who have been suffering for 200 years, but also the trauma of these innocent children who, you know, didn't harm anybody, but were caught in the crossfire. And of course from there we have Laszlo, who meets up with one of the god spawn, Sarai, or they meet up in a fantastical way through dreams, and, you know, romance ensues, but there's a whole lot of other stuff going on as well in Strange the Dreamer, and ultimately those in the sky and those on the ground become aware of each other's existence, and a big tragedy unfolds, and we're sort of on the precipice of what's going to happen next. So that's where we open up in the Muse of Nightmares. She has this, and the second novel, I think I was a little disappointed in it. I really loved, I remember just falling head over heels for the first one, and I didn't quite so much for this one. In the beginning, I think the narrative dragged a little bit because Taylor was trying to build up that suspense, but the circumstances really shouldn't have taken that long. And it also fell into those YA cliches, like, because we always need to have sexual tension, but I think the characters were feeling it at the wrong time. There was this big trauma that just happened to them, so there's that. And further through the story, Taylor introduces a bigger element, basically, which explains the whole backstory of the gods and how they ended up there. And I actually thought this new element and these new characters she introduced, maybe they should have been the main story, because the arc of what happened to them was much longer. And so it might have been interesting to flesh them out even a little bit more. But certainly in terms of world building, it was quite a feat what Taylor imagined for herself, and certainly she made inroads to continue to create new stories in this world. I mean, not specifically immediately after this duology with these particular characters, but that it would be linked to them. And in fact, it seems to be linked to her first trilogy as well. I think it was the Daughter of Smoke and Bone series, which I haven't read, so I can't really say much more than that. So ultimately, I still really enjoyed myself, but I feel like I found more flaws or disappointments in this book too. And I am really curious about how it'll do in the BookTube SFF Awards coming up, because last year I know that Strange the Dreamer did really well, and I think won both by the participants and the judges. And I'm curious, I know that this next one was popular too, but I don't think it's as good, but I don't know, it'll be interesting. Next, I did a reread for my book club. It's exciting, my first reread book in a long time. This is a short story collection, The Best Place on Earth by Ayelet Sabari. She's a Yemeni Israeli author, and I find these stories to be quite moving. We talked in the book club a bit about how they show the experience of overlooked immigrants in Israel, particularly the Mizrahi slash Middle Eastern Jewish immigrants, and also other people. Like, I think we all focused a bit on the story Invisible, which I think ultimately is my favorite story in this collection. Invisible has a Filipina caretaker as a protagonist, and she's looking over this old Yemeni Israeli matron called Savta, which is the Hebrew word for grandmother. And Savta, as they all call her, was once an orphan in Yemen, and one of the Yemen policies was that Jewish orphans were forcibly converted to Islam. And so she was on the run a little bit from Muslim authorities until ultimately her husband, who was a fair bit older, married her in order to sort of save her from that. And then they made their way to Israel, and it goes into their experiences there, where she was had a life where she was a poor woman working like in a domestic role for Ashkenazi slash Eastern European Jews who were more wealthy and established in Israel. And meanwhile, Bernice, our protagonist, is this woman from Manila. All of her family back home basically live off of her money, and she is a illegal immigrant. Her visa ran out a little while ago. She's paid under the table by Savta's family. And so she herself is also on the run, as it were, from authorities. I mean, you know, when they come up, like looking for illegal immigrants, she's, you know, on her guard. And so there's this parallel between the two of them that I thought was fascinating. And there's this magical realist conceit about whether or not they can turn invisible, because the Savta has this claim that she turned invisible once to avoid the Muslims in Yemen. I feel like my group got too caught up in that and like asking like, did this really happen or not? And that never even crossed my mind to get all worked up about whether or not Bernice and Savta could turn invisible, and I had to probe why I felt that way, really. And I feel like I just sort of it just was natural to me that how I saw that was these characters contextualizing their lives and experiences, and I didn't feel the need to approach it like some sort of lab experiment, like about what's really real in terms of scientific accuracy. Like I wasn't reading a physics textbook here. This is a story about human characters who contextualize their lives. So I don't know, that was fascinating to me, because I think a lot of these stories ended in a way that a lot of people might call open-ended. I know that's a criticism, particularly of contemporary short stories, but I feel like to me they ended in a way of emotional resonance, where they tied back into the themes that the characters were grappling with in a metaphorical way, or what have you. And I felt that way about Invisible, the ending of Invisible, where Bernice is hiding and becoming invisible from Israeli authorities. I think I might talk about this a little bit later. Steve Donahue tagged me in a tag about ending paragraphs, and I've been thinking about that in terms of these stories, because I'm grappling with why I don't find these sorts of stories as open-ended as other people do. And but overall, my group really liked this, and I loved reading it again. There's a similarity to Jhumpa Lahiri's stories. They're just very emotional, and there's a lot of backstory and world building that's just sort of deftly sewn into these short stories. I think it's quite the feat. So I hope that she continues with putting out fiction. She actually has a memoir coming out later this month, too. And finally, I read Sugar Run by Mesha Marin. It's a debut novel that just came out earlier this month, and alas, I waited too long to film this. Shame, shame, I already had to return it to the library, but here's a picture of the cover. So Sugar Run is the story of Jody, who is this West Virginia girl who 17 years before the story opens in 2007 she murdered her girlfriend and has been spending the subsequent time in prison, but she was about 17 when it happened. I think actually she was 18 years in prison. And just recently she's been released through a program that grants some clemency to younger offenders, because she was, a minor technically when she committed the crime. And Jody gets out of prison and she has this plan, that she's sort of trying to pick up where she left off. And a major part of her plan is that she wants to save her old girlfriend's brother, Ricky, who she sees as the victim of domestic violence. It seems to be at least somewhat true. The father's a bit of an ass. And then she wants to go settle on her grandmother's old land in West Virginia with him and sort of start fresh and keep that promise that she wasn't able to keep to earlier. Or keep a lot of promises, really, although it doesn't end up to be that simple, because first of all, she also gets involved with this new woman, Miranda, who's addicted to pills and is estranged from her own husband and is trying to start anew with her own young sons. And so she gets involved with this family as well. And then also, it turns out that her grandmother's land isn't theirs anymore, because while she was in prison, the government took it back due to unpaid taxes and sold it to basically a land grabber in Florida who would then, I guess, sell it to frackers and people like that. Fracking is a big part of this novel as well as drug abuse and the drug culture in the South. And also the question of Jody and whether or not she can get on her feet in a legitimate legal way, because after she meets her parole officer and he puts her on this schedule, she finds that any job she applies to, there's basically a stop sign at the idea of have you committed a felony? And she also has, very little by way of job experience or education. But I think it was a slow novel to begin with. It took me a little while to feel invested in the characters. Then when ultimately Jody had her found family and they were living on the land, squatting on the land, things started to come together, maybe in part due to the fact that there was some drama of the fracking or the drug or the interpersonal sort every other page, but overall, I didn't find that to be too over the top. I thought that the characters and the relationships were well drawn. It was certainly, for me, a look into a culture, too, that I'm not very familiar with, of the Appalachian variety. But more universally, I think it asks the question of when your life is so upended and you try to return to what you knew, can that actually happen? Or do you have, when and where should you diverge from the path and try something new? And how can you get back up on your feet? So I thought it was well written, thought-provoking, certainly worth my time, and that designation I gave it of most anticipated 2019 releases. So that about covers it for me now. You can find links to my Goodreads reviews for all of these books down below, as well as a link to my literary newsletter, which I put out every month. The literary newsletter has snippets from the Goodreads reviews, but it also has updated TBR and a book meme and a book pick and all that fun stuff that I do every month, literary news of the month that appeals to me, yada yada. And that's down below too. Here's to hoping I didn't ramble too much, because I want to get this edited and out there, and then next I'll be back at least by Friday to do my first Friday reads of the year, I think, and delve right into my February reading. So huzzah! Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I hope you also had a great reading January and a great start to February, and I'll see you next time.